So, a little over a year ago, I was invited to give a talk at UCLA, during which I somewhat blithely invoked poet, scholar, feminist, warrior, Audre Lorde, a woman with whom I, as a Black, queer, feminist child of Caribbean immigrants, have, for much of my life, aligned myself and seen as both mirror and guide. In conjuring Lorde in my talk, I affirmed her assertion that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. I was challenged during the ensuing Q&A by my friend and sister scholar, Michelle Caswell, to really examine what I thought Lorde meant by this statement. So this paper is in many ways a response to that invitation. Today I'm going to consider questions about what happens to Black bodies post-mortem from the perspectives of archival studies, performance studies, and also from digital culture studies. I want to talk about what happens to Black people after they die, about who gets a say in what happens to people, about how Black bodies are treated, and who benefits from enduring practices around the Black body as a record. I argue that even after death, people's lives are extended, prolonged, and ultimately changed in the present, future, and also in history, and that for Black Americans, these changes and extensions tend not to include the ability to construct our own agency, realities, and representations. Finally, I want to think about ways to engage a social justice framework of collaboratively developed critical resistance around Black bodies, death, and dying. Today is a presentation of some ongoing research into the aforementioned concerns. I have variously presented parts of this research at conferences over the past year or so, and I've been very grateful for the conversations that have come from those sessions as I look forward to your comments today. This work engages both humanistic and social science methodologies, including but not necessarily limited to critical archival studies, critical race theory, grounded theory analysis, and content analysis. I use the term digital culture to define this work because it simultaneously references an array of digital technologies and related practices that span a host of fields and disciplines. I also use this term because it distinguishes my engagement with these sites of inquiry from earlier terms in both cultural studies and media studies. It is my goal in this paper to articulate some contemporary conceptions of what it means to be Black and dead in digital culture without reverting to simplistic or culturally invested notions of the coherent, bounded, or stable body. Instead, I have used Gilles Deleuze's virtuality as a means of theorizing the body and embodiment. Thinking alongside feminist media scholars Michelle White, Anna Munster, and Kim Toffoletti, I conceive of virtuality as a process that combines and multiplies possibilities rather than as replacing materiality, bodies, or people. Importantly, I also reject the tendency to associate virtual experiences, social conceptions, and technologies with an escape from the body. In so doing, I would like to invoke performance studies scholar Harvey Young, who asserts in his book Embodying Black Experience, Stillness, Critical Memory, and the Black Body, that societal ideas of the Black body, an imagined and inescapable myth of Blackness, are too frequently projected across the actual bodies of Black people, often rendering them targets of abuse. In her 2012 book, Buy It Now, Lessons from eBay, media and visual culture scholar Michelle White argues that sellers and buyers in the lesbian and gay interest listings on eBay resist eBay's structures and regulations, challenging categories, rules, and values. White further asserts, however, that sellers in eBay's Black Americana category, using terms such as mammy, sambo, and nigger in their descriptive practices, have not collaboratively developed forms of critical resistance. Although White's book is arguably about resistance in its entirety, this concept of critical resistance, collaboratively developed, is quickly abandoned as White returns to the main thrust of her project, and that's okay. Retooling White's language and engaging our symposium theme of Black bodies, social justice, and archives, I'd like to suggest that the term collaboratively developed critical resistance in fact frames a kind of Black American cultural exceptionalism, a uniqueness rooted in the traditions of centuries of enslavement and deeply linked to notions of survival. So what does it mean to collaboratively develop modes of critical resistance? Historical examples abound, to be sure, but I will instead begin with one contemporary illustration. In his 2012 article, From the Black Hand Side, Twitter as a Cultural Conversation, critical race and digital media scholar Andre Brock, who we are lucky to have with us in the room right now, uses critical technocultural discourse analysis to interrogate the ways that Twitter, quote, influences and mediates racial and cultural identity, often reinforcing long-standing American racial practices and racialized discourses, end quote. Specifically addressing what has now come to be known both colloquially and academically as Black Twitter, Brock frames Black Twitter as ritual drama, highlighting the structure, engagement, invention, and performances of Black Twitter users who employ cultural touchpoints of humor, spectacle, or crisis to construct discursive racial identity. This performance of cultural signifiers, collaboratively developed by Black Twitter users in the service of a broader Black cultural identity, challenges both the narrative and structural frames asserted by popular understandings of white-dominated digital spaces. The narrative of critical resistance that emerges from Black Twitter is instead one with historical cultural roots in the spirituals or work songs of an enslaved people, a universal means of community communication and a collaboratively developed critical resistance, essential at its heart to survival, and also to grassroots efforts to mobilize for freedom and equality. To say that these means of subversive communication are essential to survival is not to overstate the case. As I suggested just moments ago, there is a societal idea of the Black body upon which narratives are projected and around which mythologies are formed. This separation of the Black body imaginary from the lived experiences of Black people is dangerous in that it creates the conditions of possibility for an ideological severing of ideas and corpus. This separation is even more pronounced in digital spaces, particularly when pain and other embodied experiences fail to connect the virtual image and the physical flesh. In 2012, the same year that White's book and Brock's article were published, 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was murdered while walking home from the store. As part of growing digital culture trends, documentary practices, content creation, for-profit photography, Instagram, citizen journalism, just as some examples, photographs snapped of Trayvon Martin's deceased body were quickly made available online, and Google Images has now classified subsets of photographs of Martin as body in casket and body on the ground. That Trayvon Martin has been reduced from vibrant teenager to dead Black body, and that the images of his dead Black body recall historical traditions of American lynching is not accidental. Scholars such as Sophia Noble have written on the political economy of Black death, and I have previously argued that for the media and for those in positions of power, there are political, social, and economic gains to be made by reinscribing images of Black death. These visual records serve as a means of power and control, a powerful reminder that one must be ever vigilant and ever in fear for one's life. I've also previously addressed the lynched Black body as souvenir. I would like to spend just a few minutes scaffolding my articulations of the Black body as souvenir with Harvey Young's articulations of Black body as fetish object, because I think these frames might be useful tools for later discussion. From the period following this, I choose not to display lynching images. From the period following the Civil War until the 1930s, the ritual, extrajudicial practice of lynching became commonplace in the United States. From 1880 to 1930, an estimated 400 Black Americans were forcefully paraded in the streets and executed for the entertainment of mass mobs and picnicking spectators. The lynching of Black Americans was a widely supported phenomenon used to enforce racial subordination and segregation. Lynching in the United States was also photographic sport. Before the passage of the Comstock Act, people sent loved ones picture postcards of lynchings they had witnessed and photographs of themselves posed with hanging corpses, widely disseminating images of disfigured and often dismembered dead Black bodies hanging from picturesque trees. Also common to lynching practices was the horrific custom of removing body parts, bits of flesh, fingers, toes, internal organs, genitalia, from lynched men, women, and children to be sold as souvenirs and often to be kept as well. These souvenirs recall and remember the performance of which they were a part. They not only gesture toward the beliefs that motivated their theft, but also render visible the body from which they were taken. This act of remembering, reconstituting, or of remembering, putting back together, is a powerful bearing witness of rendering visible what has been made indiscernible or unrecognizable. To think of the Black body as a souvenir is, in effect, to render it a tangible and material remain. Like other records, saves the past and represents it in the present. The souvenir, according to Susan Stewart, author of a book-length study on the concept, is, however, by definition incomplete. It exists after the fact, after the passage of the event or the experience of which it was once a part, as a part of the whole, in order to gesture back to the event or the experience that was. The souvenir records that which was into a material object that can be referenced and revisited over time, and onto which a retrospective narrative can be fixed. This retrospective narrative, when attached to the souvenir, fixes the past and renders it unchanging. It also creates the possibility of historical revision, though, in that the narrative itself determines the meaning of the keepsake. So keep that for a moment. I'll come back to that. Meaning charm or sorcery, the idea of the fetish was employed by 16th and 17th century Portuguese merchants to describe the figurines, trinkets, and other religious possessions of their West African trading partners. In his two-part investigative study, William Peets asserts that the fetish object has 4 traits. It is materially based, it synthesizes multiple elements into a single body, it has social value, and it has the power to affect the physical body. The first characteristic to be identified as essential to the notion of the fetish is that of the fetish object's irreducible materiality. The truth of the fetish resides in its status as a material embodiment. Second, the fetish object's power comes from its ability to fix or inscribe an originating event and to bring together previously heterogeneous elements into a novel identity. The body part as fetish object, then, has the power to assemble multiple meanings into a single body. The lynched body part can represent the deceased, the broader lynching campaign, dismemberment, white chivalry, and dozens of other meanings which rally together at the site of the body part. The third of Peets' characteristics of the fetish object is social value, and the fourth is the power to affect the physical body. For many who participated in lynching campaigns and subsequent dismemberment, the remains of the lynching victim were considered magical in that they were believed to bring luck and promote health, much like rabbit's feet. These notions of the Black body as souvenir and as fetish object extend into the digital. Here I will ask us to pause and just consider, for example, the visual records documenting Black death online. I would argue that these records, disparate digital representations of violent loss of life, both serve as souvenirs of a collectively witnessed event and have been effectively appropriated as fetish objects by the American public. For some, these digital records, digital detritus, are inauthentic versions of the self. Detached and left behind after the demise of the users, animated only by the code of the network. The novelist Zadie Smith, in an essay for the New York Review of Books in 2010, argued that interactions with the deceased online are symbolic of a more generalized devaluation of human life. For Smith, we treat people like data and data like people, leading to an inability to grasp the meaning of death when someone actually dies. It is important to note here a relationship between the current digital culture of public display of visual memory objects, such as photographs and moving images, and the emotional agency of images. The dead body of Trayvon Martin was broadcast on small screens, handheld technologies that other humans literally wear on their bodies. And even though photographs, postcards, trains, and the telegraph, the technologies of the time, made it easier to circulate images of lynched Black men, women, and children, there was no social media to replay or autoplay this death, no surprise encounters or repetition of moving images to reinstill the trauma. In this way, I argue that digital culture has created an epistemic shift. The death of Trayvon Martin and so many others have shifted the landscape of public mourning practices to digital platforms, where death and trauma are continuously reinscribed visually and perhaps eternally. In her 2007 book, Culturing Life, How Cells Became Technologies, Hannah Landecker argues that there's an assumption of living matter as technological matter that is constitutive of the times, of our times. Living cultured cells are used widely in research programs, and the cell is an important economic entity, both patentable and productive. The cell, Landecker asserts, is making a particular kind of reappearance as a central factor in today's biomedical, biological, and biotechnical settings. From tissue engineering to reproductive science, culturing the living cell outside the body has become increasingly important. So I'd like to spend just a little bit of time providing another example of Black bodies as records, and talk just briefly about how a simple cell, a single cell, can represent an entire Black body, and how a single cell, as an embodied record, can also be manipulated and disarticulated from the humanity of the Black body from which it came. Henrietta Lacks was born Loretta Pleasant on August 1st, 1920 in Roanoke, Virginia. Known to friends and family as Henny, Lacks worked as a tobacco farmer and was the mother of 6 children. In January of 1951, Henny Lacks went to Johns Hopkins Hospital, the only hospital in the area that treated Black patients, after noticing a lump in her vaginal canal during a self-examination. Lacks was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cervical cancer. Although she received treatment, Lacks unfortunately passed away in October of 1951 at Johns Hopkins. What made the Lacks case unique, beyond the very aggressive nature of her illness, was that the cell sample taken from her to the lab at Johns Hopkins was not a fixed and stained dead histological sample, but instead a fragment of living tissue. When Lacks checked into Johns Hopkins Hospital in January 1951, it was in fact de rigueur that human material was used as pathological specimens in medical research. In the case of Henrietta Lacks, however, her cells were taken to a lab whose central goal was to mimic the functions of the body to such a degree that human cells could be grown apart from the body and used in its place in experiments. Researchers at Johns Hopkins had studied Lacks's cancerous cells and observed that her cells were unique. They reproduced at a higher rate than other cells and could consequently be kept alive long enough to allow for in-depth examination and experimentation. Before Henrietta Lacks, cells cultured for laboratory studies only survived a few days, which did not allow for multiple tests to be performed on the same sample. Lacks's cells were the first to be observed that would divide multiple times without dying, and so they became known as immortal. At the same time, they were dubbed HeLa cells, taken from the first 2 letters of Lacks's first and last name, Henrietta M. Lacks, HeLa. The HeLa cells allowed for groundbreaking scientific discoveries and pharmaceutical developments. By 1954, Jonas Salk was using HeLa cells in his research to develop the polio vaccine, a vaccine that was, by the way, used primarily to save the lives of thousands of white people. The emerging possibilities for human experimentation and the implications of new tools and techniques for biomedical research were embodied by the Lacks cell line. Suddenly, the distribution and presence of what had been a single specimen from one person was in laboratories around the globe, and it presented a new way of understanding the body as data. The story of HeLa is one that has been told and retold. Many versions of the HeLa origin narrative exist. An enduring part of that narrative, though, is that Henrietta Lacks herself, the woman whose cells live even though she does not, is that of Henrietta Lacks herself, the woman whose cells live even though she does not. In the minds of many, the HeLa cells stand in for Lacks, and she for them, creating a paradox. As Landecker notes, that one party in this relation should be alive and the other dead creates a dramatic tension that continues to generate scientific papers, newspaper and magazine articles, full-length books, television documentaries, and a new Oprah movie, which I think comes out in April. The resolution of the paradox in these narratives is always the same. The woman and the cells are immortal. The woman through the cell's life and the cells through the woman's death. That Lacks gains immortality through her death is necessary to elevate the cells from life to immortal life. The origin of the HeLa cells remained mysterious for several decades, however, both for the general public and for the Lacks family, who were unaware that Lacks's cancer cells had contributed at, quote, no cost to her, was the explanation they were given, to an enormous body of research in the fields of virology, immunology, cancer research, and genetics. In 1976, Henrietta Lacks's family discovered that people were buying and selling Lacks's cells. Then, in 1985, portions of Henrietta Lacks's medical record were published without her family's knowledge or consent. By 2013, researchers had mapped Lacks's DNA genome and published the code online. Lax's family argued that the published genome laid bare their most intimate health information, making it digitally available to the public and denying them the opportunity to craft their own narratives about their bodies, their heritage, their health, and their future selves. Genetic information can be stigmatizing, and while it's illegal for employees or health insurance providers to discriminate based on that information, this is not true for life insurance, disability coverage, or long-term care. After hearing, and I'd be surprised if it continues to be true for health insurance. After hearing from the Lax family, the European team apologized, revising the news release, and they quietly took the data offline, but at least 15 people had already downloaded it. They also pointed the Lax family to other databases that had published portions of the genetic data, also without consent. The Lax family resisted the repurposing of their loved one's body as a commercial tool. This was not the case at first, however, with Afeni Shakur Davis, the mother of rap legend Tupac Shakur. Holography and other 3D technologies, as well as 2D illusions such as Pepper's Ghost, have been used to create lifelike reproductions of deceased performers and political figures, reproductions capable of addressing the audience, moving around on stage, and interacting with others using pre-scripted effects. Employing a complex mix of creative sound editing, motion capture techniques, CGI, and holographic technologies, it is now possible to see a reanimated virtual facsimile of the dead. Technologies have always externalized sensory data, transforming human consciousness and conceptions of the self. Writing transforms our memory, reshaping humans as individuals and as social beings. Radio extends what we can hear, television extends what we can hear and see. New media technologies are understood to create a digital self in which our cognitive and perceptual capabilities are distributed beyond the limits of the body. The history of technology is one in which memories and thoughts are externalized, conjoining the human with technologies beyond the skin. Are we perhaps, in the words of Brian Rotman, becoming beside ourselves, externalizing so much data that our bodies exist as information hybridized with the technological? In May 2014, for example, a Pepper's Ghost reproduction of Michael Jackson performed Jackson's 1991 song, Slave to the Rhythm. Jackson died in 2009. Slave to the Rhythm at the Billboard Music Awards. It's not lost on me. Similarly, 2 years earlier, in 2012, a Pepper's Ghost reproduction of deceased rapper Tupac Shakur, who died in 1996, enhanced by Museon eyeliner technology, performed on stage alongside rapper Snoop Dogg and producer Dr. Dre at the Coachella Music and Arts Festival. The practice of resurrecting performers and public figures who have died has become popular with audiences around the world. However, the use of technology to reanimate the dead comes with a complex set of social, cultural, technical, and ethical concerns, including questions of representation, embodiment, agency, and the power to construct one's own narratives and reality. After Coachella, Tupac's mother reported being disappointed in the digital resurrection of her son. While extensions of corporeality allow for a posthumous reconstruction, they cannot bring back the dead. Tupac and other artists had their identities and their bodies reconstructed in death as a means of extending life, and certainly in the case of Coachella, I would argue that this reconstruction served mainly to satisfy a white gaze. So returning to my original charge, to reflect upon Audre Lorde's master's tools, I want to think about collaboratively developed critical resistance in ways that I think resonate with Lorde's work on building community, knowing that, in Lorde's own words, without community, there is certainly no liberation, no future, only the most vulnerable and temporary armistice between me and my oppression. I'm going to use my last few minutes to briefly make 3 suggestions for moving forward that center the Black body, social justice, and the archives. These suggestions are the radical act of records creation, reclaiming our narratives, and reducing data silences. It is no secret that American archives and archivists have come under fire for privileging, preserving, reproducing a national history that is predominantly white, silencing the voices and histories of marginalized peoples and communities. Indeed, I contend that American archival institutions can be seen as contributing to an amnesty that prevents transitional and restorative justice for Black Americans in the United States. In embodying Black experience, stillness, critical memory, and the Black body, Harvey Young chronicles a set of Black experiences, or what he calls phenomenal Blackness, that developed not only from the resistance, from the experience of abuse, but also from a variety of performances of resistance that were devised to respond to the highly predictable and anticipated arrival of racial violence within a person's lifetime. What does a collaboratively developed critical resistance look like in a digital culture of racial violence? When we consider the work song and Black Twitter as examples, the clearest example of collaboratively developed critical resistance is the movement for Black lives known as Black Lives Matter. While we have already begun to unpack how complicated these records are, Doc Now, Black Twitter, and Black Lives Matter demonstrate that in communities of color there may be tremendous social capital involved in both the capture and the widespread distribution of records. Most often created by community members for a common good, they can be part of a socially networked system of reclaiming, bearing witness, and producing evidence. In 1868, President Andrew Johnson issued Proclamation 179, giving amnesty to those who had sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War. The proclamation restored all rights of property, except slaves, to Confederate landowners who swore renewed allegiance to the United States. I actually have some records of this that are fascinating. The proclamation effectively pardoned all offenses enacted by whites against former slaves. Johnson's amnesty removed the possibility and necessity of accountability, reinforcing the cultural and social supremacy of Southern whites. Johnson's amnesty sent the message that Southern whites could construct a new normal under the protection of the law, reinscribing the violence of slavery and establishing the jurisprudence of lynch law. Archives are meant to preserve a shared national history. The first organized archival collection shows up in this country somewhere around 1791. Lynch law as a means of social control lasts until about 1940. Why are there only a small handful of records to document over 100 years of lynching? And why should this matter? In countries such as South Africa, Cambodia, Puerto Rico, and El Salvador, and Canada, archival records have been used by Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and war tribunals to secure restorative and transitional justice. In 1996, supported by documented abuses as well as living testimonies, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa bore witness to and reported crimes relating to human rights violations. Khmer Rouge clerks recorded the names and personal histories of thousands of prisoners who were tortured and killed at Tulsa prison. These records, along with the mugshots of the victims, personnel files of the killers, and Khmer Rouge security documents, are being used in the Cambodia tribunals. Although there have been calls for reparations for the descendants of enslaved Americans, records that would aid in such transitional justice for American Blacks have generally not been collected or maintained by U.S. government archives. Archives have effectively extended Johnson's amnesty, we call this archival amnesty, by failing to document the atrocities of the past. Without a documentary record, justice remains elusive. Archival amnesty impedes justice and contributes to a national culture of continued violence against American Blacks. In the face of the alarming increase in police violence against Black bodies, collaborations among professional archivists and communities have been effective in collecting stories and documenting violence and injustice in vulnerable communities. These documentation efforts are also an attempt to create an historical record, eliminating the possibility of erasure and enabling the possibility of justice. And so I arrive at my first action step. Use the hashtags. Say her name, Black Lives Matter, in her honor, etc. When you use them, you create an historical record. And I know there are some archivists right here in this room doing the work to make sure that that record is preserved. You also help to shape the narrative. So Alonso and Yasso reference storytelling as an established qualitative method within the social sciences. This methodological tool has been utilized with great breadth in the United States to focus on the issues of concern for disenfranchised and underrepresented communities, to construct alternative realities to those constructed through social institutions of dominant culture. Dunbar talks about the narrative as a mode of applying critical race theory to archival discourse. Harvey Young, in his article, talks about narrative as crucial to meaning-making with souvenirs. If it is narrative, then, that makes meaning with objects, such as the souvenir and fetish object, which we've already extended to our understanding of digital records, then these narratively defined records can be read or constructed using critical race theory, as Dunbar suggests, in the discourse around souvenirs as archival objects as a mode of resistance, social justice, and liberation. Let's remake meaning. Finally, data work that aspires to global scales is increasingly common, often collaboratively or collectively undertaken. Many of these data projects aim to address planet-scale social problems and enact social change. What makes these projects all the more fascinating and provocative is the thoroughly Western and Northern perspectives that govern the current data landscape. Even data teams working on historical, social, and economic inequality thus far have not employed data in the service of communities of color. It isn't that these data don't exist. Rather, the issue is that the data teams, despite a rhetoric of breadth and depth, are frequently narrow in composition. They are also frequently blissfully unaware of data surveillance practices' impact on communities of color. Whereas in professions like early anthropology, in which data was gathered from elsewhere to make claims about specific groups of others, what we currently see in data practices is data gathered around cleanliness and convenience to make claims about everyone, everywhere, by teams that, at least for now, lack broad representation, inclusivity, and transhemispheric participation. If we want to see justice, we must reclaim the data itself as one of our tools. It is vitally important that we not only structure new narratives from data, but that we address the silences, gaps, and vagaries in that data and demand to have a say in how data about us is used, lest we be reduced to digital objects. I just want to close by stressing again that we must find ways to collaboratively develop these kinds of critical resistance. Perhaps we can begin by creating new records, creating new narratives, and controlling our data. What I do know is that our lives literally depend on it. Thank you.